Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. I wanted to thank you for joining us today for our webinar on how companies and investors can restore trust in democracy, featuring Elizabeth Doty, National Program Leader for Business for American Promise, and Rick Alexander, founder of the Shareholder Commons. Next slide, please. This webinar is part of the Future 500 Virtual Summit, which we are presenting in collaboration with our wonderful partners at EarthX in celebration of Earth Day 50. My name is Eric Wohlgemuth, and I'm the COO at Future 500. We are a nonprofit consultancy that builds trust between companies, advocates, investors, and philanthropists to advance business as a force for good. Along with Elizabeth and Rick, I'm joined here by several members of our team who are working hard behind the virtual curtain to make this a seamless webinar. So many thanks, team. Next slide, please. Today's agenda. This is what you're going to expect in the next hour. We'll share a few logistics with you. After that, I'm going to invite Elizabeth and Rick to introduce themselves, and then they will dive in to present a few slides. This is to be a conversation format, so I will be jumping in with questions throughout. I want to take a moment to recognize our partner EarthX, which is an international nonprofit environmental forum whose purpose is to educate and inspire people to action towards a more sustainable future. So let's dive in, shall we? The Future 500 team recently published our 9th annual Force for Good forecast report, which highlights top ESG trends we anticipate will shape engagement between corporations and external stakeholders in the coming year and beyond. One of our trends, which you see circled here, relates to our webinar topic today, which is growing pressure on companies to be transparent about their political spending and influence, which is increasingly viewed as eroding public trust in democracy and capitalism. So we were thrilled to connect with Elizabeth and Rick, two leaders who are collaborating to tackle money in politics, getting investors and corporations to take actions that can restore public trust in democracy. Next slide, please. Elizabeth and Rick, I'd like to invite you both to turn on your videos, please, and unmute yourself. Hi there.
Hello.
Wow.
Rick, great. I'm going to start with you, Rick. You've had quite a remarkable intellectual journey to arrive here today. You're one of the world's most highly regarded corporate governance lawyers. You're the author of 3 books, of numerous articles and reputable publications with names like Harvard. And at one time, I read that you were the leading lawyer engaged in upholding the Milton Friedman theory-based law of the land that placed shareholder primacy above all else. But then in 2011, you took a big pivot. So please do tell.
Wow, that was a quite an introduction, and I'm not sure I can take full credit for being the ultimate defender of Milton Friedman, but certainly was in the camp of most corporate lawyers. I had a 25-year career there of believing that, you know, the best way to run our economy was to have companies compete for profits, and those profits would represent value created, and to let the government regulate if there were externalities. And I think a lot of the things we've seen in the last few years call that into question, and that's why I'm here today, and I think that's what we'll be talking about.
Great, thank you, Rick. So this is one of those reformed lawyer stories, perhaps?
Oh, absolutely. About 5 years ago, I left the practice of corporate law, went to work for a nonprofit called B-Lab, which was focused on helping companies certify as being good for the environment and good for society. And it has a legal aspect of changing your legal structure so that you have a duty to stakeholders as well as shareholders. And about a year ago, I spun out of B-Lab and have formed a nonprofit focused really on shareholders, institutional shareholders, and helping them pursue that idea. It's called the Shareholder Commons. The idea that all companies and all shareholders really depend on a set of common resources that we need to preserve.
Great, thank you. So Elizabeth, I was similarly captured by hearing your story about how you arrived at where you are today. You gained inspiration from Lawrence Lessig, who wrote the great book Republic Lost, Jeff Clements, who wrote another great book called Corporations Are Not People, Reclaiming Democracy from Big Money and Global Corporations, and your father, a conservative who's enjoyed success in business. So can you briefly share here with our audience how their influences all came together in the work we're here to discuss today.
Yeah, true. And it's interesting. I will say I haven't mentioned this to you yet, Eric, but I came up as a economics major undergrad, studying neoclassical economics. And as I went into corporate consulting, got my business degree at a conservative school, mainstream school, and over time I became concerned about climate. And I began looking at what are the systemic barriers to acting on climate change, which has such severe threats and is so difficult. And I began to realize that we're in some major systemic dysfunctions. It wasn't working the way I understood in undergrad. In fact, the full quote from Milton Friedman about the obligation to pursue profit for shareholders within society's rules of the game. The question becomes, what happens when companies can drive those rules of the game? Where do we go then? So I had a rare opportunity in 2012 to actually be a fellow. I'm a kind of a closet academic after corporate consulting. So I've got both the on the ground in the companies trying to implement strategy and live their brands, and then with this research project with Lawrence Lessig. And I'll never forget him sitting there, concerned with these institutional corruption where no individual is doing anything strictly unethical and the whole system is going down the tubes. Kind of ring true. And he sat there and he said, what is it we could do that would have us not kicking the can, not continuing to kick the can? And when he showed me and the fellows that were part of that, the role of political spending in allowing us to punt or block action on really difficult issues, I started to get very concerned. I wrote about it. I started to write here about corporate promises for Strategy and Business magazine. And my father pulled me aside, and he's not only a conservative businessman, but a practical entrepreneur. And he said, stop with the talk and the writing, let's do something. And we reached out to Jeff Clements and said, what can business people do to address, the root causes where the rules of the game enable so much political spending that we can block action. So, and I want to just add that Rick and I are here today together as part of a working group that's working on the legitimate corporate engagement in democracy reform, political spending, but other reforms as well.
This is great. Well, you're taking on a big issue, and I know I'm certainly looking forward to the presentation, and I know our audience is as well. So I think let's turn it over to you, Elizabeth. I think you're going to run through the next several slides.
That sounds great. Yeah, thank you, and thanks to Andrea to advancing it. So let's go to the next slide, and I want to set a little context. Rick and I have agreed I'll set some of the contextual factors and things I think would be useful to you all to think about. I wish we were in a room where we could have long discussions to dive into this. There's a lot to it, but hopefully this will get the process started. And we are in this time. I'm finding we also have a little more time and maybe a little more bandwidth to think bigger picture about those systemic shifts and what's preventing us from responding to the challenges that we need to address urgently. So as I mentioned, Rick and I proposed to come talk to you all as members of a working group that includes Rebecca Henderson at Harvard, Bill Weil, who you'll be hearing from in a week or two, Matt Patsky and Jonas Krohn from Trillium Asset Management, Kevin Johnson, who I think is here we're fellow members of a business civic engagement group called Leadership Now, several other people, several others from American Promise, the group I talked about, working on the problem of money and political spending. And we'd like to talk to you today just more broadly about trust in democracy and the role of business in that process, and some counterintuitive approaches that I'm finding in conversations with my colleagues and clients and classmates from business school. People are taking a more systemic view on that, and we'd like to bring in some factors you might want to think more deeply about, part of that theme that Eric mentioned. And I think engaging these factors and some of the barriers and factors driving distrust forces us and forces people in positions of responsibility in companies to wrestle with some really big structural dilemmas. It's a prisoner's dilemma, collective action, arms race kind of problem. So we want to frame up what we're understanding about that from multiple perspectives, from the CSR, government affairs, company perspective, from a civic perspective, and then Rick will go into some depth on the investor and shareholder perspective. and then bring you to a couple propositions and 2 paths we think might be strategies for action with near-term and longer-term consequences. The 2 propositions are that companies urgently need a principled basis for engaging in public affairs and government policy that clarifies the stakeholders that are driving their thinking, and that getting there to that principled basis requires engaging some of the current dysfunctional incentives. So before we dive in kind of to our point of view, I'd like to invite via chat, if you would. I think it's a no-brainer that companies are stepping up and recognizing systemic issues. This may seem like forever ago from August, the Business Roundtable statement that companies really put themselves on the hook to serve a range of stakeholders, not just shareholders. You know, they're not always seen as living up to this. There are many dilemmas, as we've talked about, and some disappointments, but there's definitely more going on the record, right? Making the big promises. And so I'd like to ask you, if you would, in chat very quickly here, why are businesses stepping forward? What are some of the forces pushing business to get more involved in, either framed as systemic challenges facing society, addressing issues that government hasn't been able to? What is it? And if you would just see a few comments in chat would be very helpful. As you're typing, I'll share some of the ones I've come across. One is just they're changing societal expectations, right? That companies are being pushed by their employees. Millennials have a much more obvious and explicit desire to believe in what their companies, I see that here, yes. Their employees are calling them out. We see increasingly employees caring about company positions. In some ways, there are ways that businesses are trusted, and particularly trusted to be competent. Other reasons are that the systems are not working, right? That in terms of shared prosperity, addressing longer term threats, having the economy work for the long term, having communities work, and then yes, around the climate crisis, right? Areas
Elizabeth,
that
sorry, don't mean to interrupt. We're getting a ton of great things coming in here. I think people are already building on what you're saying. Shareholder advocacy, ESG investors, the climate crisis, you name it. They're all popping in here.
Thanks. Very good. Very good. And we need it, right? So if we go to the next slide, this kind of reinforces one reason we need it. We don't often see this in such a long time horizon, but this is an aggregation of surveys since 1960 through different administrations, different eras. You'll see some ups and downs through it, but the longer term trend is clear. That trust in government always or most of the time has been declining. Just one measure of that larger trend in our society, which is troubling because there's the famous quote, "As trust goes, so goes the world."
And Elizabeth, this is U.S. specific data. I'm just curious, does this data exist for all other countries, perhaps? And do you recall the source of this chart?
Yeah, this one is Pew as of 2019, and it's longitudinal, and they've cross-mapped some differences in definitions going all the way back through some surveys by other groups. I think they collaborated with Gallup, and I'd be very happy after the call to provide the specific source of this one. This is US specific. There is trend data for other countries as well, but it's done more through Edelman, the World Value Survey, and a couple of others. And the interesting thing there is there has been a lot of decline in trust in institutions and a growing trust gap between those who feel they're doing well in a society, trust the institutions, and those who don't feel they aren't.
Thank you, helpful.
If we could keep going, the next slide kind of shows there is some assertion that business is trusted, but if you really look at it's more trusted than, if you look near the bottom there, a big business is more trusted than newspapers, the criminal justice system, the television news, or Congress. But when you look in the larger scheme of things, there's still a lot of question about even business, even though in some studies, some recent ones, business is touted as being more trusted. There's still a lot of room to grow and room to improve. And these are raising fundamental questions around institutions of capitalism, democracy. The latest Edelman Trust Barometer showed that 56% around the world, and I think 53% in the US, believe capitalism is causing more harm than good. And similarly, and across different age groups, people starting to question democracy, age groups, gender, and location starting to question democracy. So there's a lot at risk, and there's a kind of a general sense of discouragement and cynicism. And if we don't need to be reminded as to how much that matters, we can see it with the coronavirus, right? If people trust the institutions and what we need to do, very serious consequences. But it's also true for investing, for starting a business, for long-termism, for employees that work hard. Litigiousness, all kinds of things are affected by the general level of trust. And trust is actually in institutions is correlated with GDP growth. So why is trust so low? And can we see a few answers in chat on that one? If we're going to try and address this, and if business has a role to play, what are some of the reasons why trust is so low? Yes, thank you. I see the crisis of civic engagement. And I will suggest at the end, there are some excellent groups and they're starting to organize together around building civic engagement. Yes, information issues are a major factor in the distrust. Yeah. Interesting. So we see one, corporate influence in lawmaking. Thank you. This is the one that doesn't come up as often amongst my colleagues, but they may not be as aware of it as you all, and that itself becomes a challenge. Partisanship, yes, related to civility. Okay, great. We see a couple on the corporate involvement. If you go to the next slide, and there's a lot to piece together on this view. I'm going to try and keep it brisk so we can focus on the questions that look a little bit more forward. My employer is still the most trusted. In fact, this has been true for a couple years. This is through the Edelman Trust Barometer. And it's more trusted than business overall, which is around 58%. In the US, business is at about 50% by the Edelman Barometer and declined 4 points last year.
Hey, Elizabeth?
Yeah, go ahead.
Quick question here. So there's trust in those who sign your paycheck based on this slide. And based on your prior slide, I'm curious, is this trust higher? It's higher for small businesses than for large ones. And so do you presume that this will get worse due to coronavirus, particularly for big companies, but also for small companies?
Yeah, small business, everybody loves to think about small business, and we've kind of, it's the epitome of kind of the American dream, right? So small businesses tend to be trusted, larger businesses tend to be less trusted, you saw some of the reasons why. This is an amalgamation of both of those in the gray business column. So we could see that declining further as small business suffers. Is less of an aspect of it. So let's go to the next slide. Again, in the Edelman 2019, when we think about the expectations of those employees in their employer, they're pushing their leaders to speak out. And you'll hear more from Bill Weil on this. Pushing to speak out, this goes to some of the causes of distrust. Concern about the future, worry that my interests in a good job for my kids, with automation and outsourcing, wanting our companies to take action on those. Ethical use of technology, privacy, very relevant right now as we talk about tracking and tracing. The sources of income inequality, speaking up for diversity, acting on climate change, and acting on immigration and the rights of people from other countries. And they're asking CEOs to take the lead rather than waiting for the government to take action.
Hey, Elizabeth,
So,
this is great. This really speaks to another of the top trends that we had this year, which is about how companies are increasingly taking public stands on tough political issues like gun control, for example, and also inviting their customers to join them in taking action. We did a webinar last year with Professor Mike Toffel from Harvard Business School, really talking about this trend in CEO activism. So I'm glad to see you highlight that here.
Yeah, it's a very interesting one, and we see a lot of the pros, and in fact, there's a deafening silence when CEOs don't speak up, right, as role models in society and as having so much influence, and by the products that we offer, right, or that companies offer. But on the other hand, the question is, are there any cons to this? Are there any negatives, any risks? And I'm gonna, in the interest of time, given where we are in the hour, I'm gonna breeze by this, though I would love for you all to weigh in. I will share a couple that I'm hearing. I have many friends that are in CSR roles, ESG investing roles, some in government affairs, some in strategy. The ones I'm hearing from strategy level are there's a deluge. Which issues do we take on? Everybody's coming to us. On what basis do we do this? On what is our legitimate role in an issue that's not related to our industry? And then secondly, clearly there's the risk of blowback, right? You can see it in the headlines around the stimulus packages being negotiated right now. Whatever a company does gets heightened scrutiny, though Professor Toffel's work shows that you get it from not speaking up as well, and you might as well think it through and take a stand. Generally, when we think about stepping up, it's in the form of training, education, wages, opportunities, investment in talent, or advocating for something on a level like equality or rights for people of all backgrounds or interests or preferences. Investing in products for the longer term, stepping up to innovate for climate, and maybe some civic participation. And to the question around civic engagement, there's an excellent movement right now on time to vote and having companies help their employees take time to vote. But let's look at the next slide. If we go there's another cause of distrust that you all mentioned that honestly, I have to say many of the people I speak with, it is not top of mind. And in fact, many CEOs will say, if the government is not working effectively, it's our obligation to step in and help with systemic issues, hopefully directly and potentially through formal policy changes, like a privacy data policy, something like that. But what they don't dig into is that distrust in government is related to the political spending. And we rarely hear in the dialogue so far, companies thinking about their own engagement with government as potentially a driver of the distrust, an area of risk to their reputations. It's, as Eric mentions, it's increasingly under scrutiny, but it's not the first place companies go. And of course, it's important that we do think about it because it's the place where you'd start with do no harm. So all the claims about draining the swamp, the system is rigged, pay-to-play politics. This is an interesting chart to me. It was from a University of Maryland study in 2016, looking at the sources of voter anger. And you can see this answer around corporations and lobbyists having too much influence was a majority across the board by demographic. So clearly a major driver and issue with distrust. It was the single most frequently mentioned answer in the write-in answers. They analyzed 3,400 write-in answers. I was in a Pew study on American trust in democracy, and government ineffectiveness driven by pay-to-play politics was the single most frequently mentioned concern. If we go to the next slide, we'll show a big loophole here, and I think an area of risk that the work we're going to talk about today is designed to at least empower you all to share with your colleagues and to propose some action. Michael Porter and Catherine Gale and colleagues came out with the third in a series of reports in December. And chapter 3 of that report, called the report is A Recovery Squandered, says that a high proportion of business leaders are not fully aware of how their companies are interacting with the political system, and they view their own company's engagement favorably or neutral, basically providing information or expertise, but business overall as negative by advancing special interests over public interests. And you can see the starkness of the gap here from roughly 20% to roughly 60% when viewing their own company versus the larger system. And it's an interesting thing because it points to the fact that when companies engage in public policy, they rarely describe the principles that are guiding them and or the stakeholder interests. So it could be to exacerbate the market failures Rick mentioned. It could be lobbying for not having to account for full cost pricing or externalities or information asymmetry, or it could be expertise to help the public interest. It's just not known. And business people, at least in this survey of MBA alumni, said they view their own company as on the former, right, on the good ones. The fact is we don't know, and we'll get to the disclosure question. I can tell I am going to have to breeze through some of these, Eric, to get to the really important issues and to make sure Rick can weigh in. Why don't I
thanks.
say—
I was about to suggest that.
Yeah. There's more to this. Happy to share the slides. The next slide simply shows the magnitude of the increase in spending. This is outside political spending, enabled by fundamental shifts in the rules for political spending, along with shifts in other political engagement practices. The next one shows that there's a highly uneven disclosure, even with the incredible work of the Center for Political Accountability. If you just look at the red, you can see in the many ways that companies engage, a significant portion are still not disclosed, and many of those through trade associations are not disclosed, and that affects both trust and oversight. And I'm reminded here of a story from a CSR consultant in my research, and I do want to share this one. I was talking about living your values at work, and she said, I'm so troubled because some of the companies I'm working for are playing both sides of an issue, and they don't even know it. In fact, government affairs is just down the hall from CSR executive office, and they're not talking to each other. So if we're not disclosing, we're not managing, the oversight is weak, we open up the door to the next thing, which is the structural risk.
Yeah,
next slide.
Yeah, Elizabeth, that's one of the main challenges with the companies we work with, that the right hand's not speaking to the left. The disconnect right, where government affairs is operating in ways that are undermining the sustainability goals that the company has.
And people don't know your intent, right? They don't know the intent of the people inside, but they use consistency as a proxy for sincerity. So if you go to the next slide, this is the structural dilemma that the two solutions Rick and I will bring in are designed to elevate. The first is, on the one hand, companies might be tempted to stop engaging in political activity. If you look down the left side, you see all the potential blowback, right? And the increasing scrutiny. There are new scorecards, the things you may be doing that are not aligned with your public commitments. And in the center, we have a report that summarizes this from the CPA. But on the right side, you have the drivers of being in an arms race or a prisoner's dilemma. There's literally a thing called a milker bill that I learned about a year ago, where elected officials will propose legislation strictly to threaten companies and push them to make contributions in order to get at the seat of the table to discuss the error of the legislation and to be heard and have it taken off the table. And secondly, we're in an environment with so much short-term pressure on executives that anything that gets a return in the short term, it's very hard to refrain from. And so studies have shown there's an incredible ROI on lobbying, which is driven by contributions that give you credibility with lobbyists. So yes, a milker bill and double milker bills, and I will share more of the link on here. There's an article in the New York Times about those. So
no wonder young people are getting disillusioned with our system.
Yeah. Okay, so Eric, I think what I'd like to do is skip the next slide and show the summary from two credible sources and then over to Rick. So if you could skip to costs to companies. Aside from the terrible impact on democracy and the legitimate concern over a rigged system, the conclusion from the Harvard study is that this is working against long-term interests of business and the environment of business, where you can focus on creating value in the marketplace. And it makes it harder to do well by doing good by fostering cronyism, crowding out investment, distracting management, penalizing stronger competitors, right? Somebody who refrains from taking advantage of market failures, increases regulatory complexity. That's why the tax code is still 74,000 pages long, and increases the systemic instability. So other than that, we don't have a problem. But what many people don't yet think about if they do think about political influence of companies, is the cost to investors. And Leo Strine, if you go to the next slide, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Delaware, someone Rick knows, has written an incredible article on the irresponsibility of contributing and political spending on behalf of shareholders who are typically employees and no say. And he poses the question, on what legitimate basis do we do this? Is this actually in the shareholders' interests, even if that were the argument? So Rick, let me turn it over to you to talk a bit about looking at the systemic level impact to investors.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to EarthX and Future 500, National Geographic for putting all this together, and to all of you for being here. Time is valuable, and this is an important issue, so appreciate everybody being here. Eric said earlier, I've talked to Elizabeth a lot now, and I could listen to her all day talk about this stuff, and it's critical. And I wish you had more time to sort of, but I think looking at your comments, everybody understands the critical nature of the issues we face, whether it's inequality, climate change, human rights violations, other resource depletion, and the problem with political spending getting in the way of fixing those issues. And to go back to something, we've been talking about those on a company basis, but to go back to something Eric said at the beginning of the call, we're all in this together. And I think, when you're all in this together, it's not just that you all should help, it's that you often can't solve the problem unless everybody works together because of various, commons issues or prisoners' dilemmas issue, whatever name you want to give it. And that's really what I want to talk about that's why I want to talk about this issue from the shareholder basis. So if we kind of like do the animation on this page, we can see sort of how people think about investment generally. People like you and me put our money into 401k plans or into pension plans, and they go to the pension trustee or to BlackRock, and they give them to asset managers who, security select and steward those assets down into the real economy, where people make actual decisions about how to deploy those resources. And what people expect back, I think there's one more click on the animation, or two more, and is the return. And this is how people think about the investments. Like when you look at your statement, hope you haven't looked at it in a couple of months, it's really not worth the time right now. But the real thing people do is compare, because if you would be happy if you had some stocks that had made 0% this year, because that would mean they had done much better. So everything is alpha, is the idea that the way we measure return is to compare individual companies or portfolios that managers are putting together for us, and to see how they do against comparable baskets of securities. And that's success or failure. And that's really kind of how people mostly think about the investing system. And as you sort of, I'm sure you know where I'm going here, that's not we're in this all together. So let's go to the next slide. And let's think about what do investors care about? Why is there an investing system?
We lost you, Rick. I think we had a little freeze on the happening here.
System where, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, okay. And so the question then becomes, what are we going to do, or what is the issue, and what is it that people really want out of the investing chain? And you think about what's the goals of this chain. It's obviously for people to protect and grow their savings, but I would emphasize it's so that it can have, a healthy, long-term, diversified portfolio, because that's how we invest these days. And just to state the obvious, if your company is getting ahead by lobbying for regulations that actually reduce the value of the overall economy, then you're actually not helping your investors, because what you're gaining with one hand, your investors are losing with the 499 other hands in their S&P 500 portfolio. And we also save in order to transfer our wealth to ourselves in the future and to future generations. And again, that's because we want ourselves to have a good retirement, or we want our children to have material well-being. And of course, if the things that your investees are doing are detracting from future value, you're not really succeeding in that. And I just don't think there's a better illustration than what's happening today. I mean, we are learning how thin the line, we're learning that we're on this together, but the more scary part of it is we're learning how thin the line is between our material well-being and civilization and things not being so well, as we see even in the US, threats to the food chain start to develop. But the other side of the capital chain is that we use it in order to funnel capital, in order to develop resources and use them to create goods and services for the economy. So once again, if individual companies are chasing profits without regard to how their conduct ultimately serves society, you're not really achieving that goal. And it's really the same point with respect to stewarding those assets once they're allocated. So let's go to the next slide and see what the real picture looks like. So here's what the capital chain really ought to look like. That same capital chain on the left, and on the right on the top, you see that alpha arrow. But the blue arrows represent all the other things that investors should be caring about. They care about their portfolio, and that return, sometimes called beta, the return of the overall market. And while it might be about 80% in an active portfolio, if you're indexed, and more of us are, that's really 100% of your return. It doesn't matter whether one company beats another company. What matters is how the market does over the long term. Similarly, you might care about your most important financial asset might be your employment. David Weber at Boston University Law School always tells a story about a retiree, a worker in a janitor in a Massachusetts school system whose pension was invested in a private equity fund that invested in a company that did janitorial services. And at some point, that company came in and bid for all the school system's services, and he was reoffered his job at a 56% pay cut. And so that the pursuit of value for his portfolio caused him to lose his livelihood. The other story I like to think about that's even more depressing is how many of us, somewhere in our 401k, were earning money from the apparel chain, the supply chain around the world, when 1,100 people died in Bangladesh in the Rana Plaza factory fire. And none of us, I'm sure, on this call would have cared about the few pennies of earnings that the lack of safety got into our portfolio. And so there's just all these things that we care about that actually, if we're maintaining our portfolio, that are more important than simply alpha. And so we can go to the next slide and try to tie this back to today's subject, political spending. So if investors can think of their investments in a less financialized way, they can think of being active to improve beta. And they can think about collective actions, because the fact is that there are many things that we would like companies to do that companies might like to do. I mean, I looked at a lot of the answers, in earlier pieces, and some of the reasons that companies would like to do things are, very pro-social, but it's very difficult to do that. We're a capitalist society. And if someone else is going to jump in and take the opportunity that you forego, you haven't really improved things. You've just foregone some profit for your shareholders. But shareholders have the ability to think collectively. And what they can do is design guardrails that apply to all companies. And that really is what the Shareholder Commons, my organization, is all about, looking for those types of guardrails. And the project that I'm working on with Elizabeth, part of that is to come up with a guardrail that all companies and investors can agree on. So we can go to the next slide. And, you know, obviously these are the reasons when you start to think more holistically about investing, and think about what Elizabeth was saying, why it makes sense that investors would work collectively on these issues, because that way they can build more trust, and trust, as Elizabeth said, is directly correlated with GDP. GDP is directly correlated with the returns of your diversified portfolio. And it's just a waste of resources. It's like, you know, the arms race, if you think about the real arms race, the Soviet Union and the United States and others were spending lots of resources figuring out how they could get more warheads on one missile rather than investing in their society, the peace dividend. So it's a waste of resources. And the fact is that the way companies successfully, when companies successfully lobby for individual favor, what they might be doing is derailing an effort of collective action on the part of the country as a whole through government. And so what we're doing is we're investing in government relations and detracting from value rather than in innovation itself. And that's, move to the next slide. And look, shareholders already care about this. These are just some numbers from some current documents that we can, you know, supply you links to these documents that just show that shareholders do think about this. And what we want to add to the process is kind of a holistic, rather than, you know, one resolution at a time, which is getting the work done. Try to be very holistic about it so that we are raising the level of the playing field that everyone is on, and taking advantage of the collective action as a way to address the prisoner's dilemma, arms race, game theory problems people deal with.
And Rick, just a quick clarification here. Your prior slide said responsible investors, but you know, I think this is mainstreaming kind of the adoption of ESG screens by institutional investors. So this is not a niche issue anymore. This has become mainstream.
Very much, and I think that's exactly right, Eric. And I think that gives us an opportunity to think about political spending as one of the very first guardrails that could be applied in a platform of guardrails to raise the sustainability level for all companies on all matters.
Great. And one question came in, if you have any commentary about the idea of stewarding capital to regenerate rather than simply preserve social, economic, and environmental systems. Don't know if this is the right place for that, or if you want to integrate it into your remarks.
I just think that's absolutely right. It's a better word. Sometimes it's easy to describe the absence of a negative than positivity, but I think it is true that we're in a point where, whether it's the environment or social institutions or the trust in our political institutions, we do need to be thinking about corporate activity that regenerates, you know, whether that's capturing carbon or having everybody give their employees an opportunity to vote. We need more than the absence of negatives.
Great. We have about 7 minutes left, so I want you guys to get to your principles. So keep going, Rick.
I think I'll jump in. Rick, do you mind if we, I think the next slide
great.
reinforces
Perfect.
This one from Zicklin. So if we go 2 slides, there we go, propositions to consider, next one. Great, thank you. So I will give a little headline on the pivot point for us. We think for all of you, and at the end we have our emails, very much hope to begin a conversation on this. We believe that companies urgently need a principled basis for engaging in both political processes and civic reform to address the distortions we've talked about. You can see here some resources interest is growing, but getting there requires thinking very creatively about the prisoner's dilemma, the arms race, of something that would have would make it possible for more companies to get in, to scale, no one having to unilaterally disarm. But doing that, as Rebecca Henderson says, means putting down some of our weapons. So it's a hurdle. My question is this the time for that? We're seeing breakthroughs in collaboration, and actually I think people are at the end of their ropes around game playing versus getting a new era started where we can focus on investing in the future. So Rick and I, so this working group has one main project, and if you could show the next slide, but in parallel, Rick has kindly begun his first guardrail for investors in parallel, which we think these complement each other in a related vein. So the working group's project has been to draft a company commitment to democracy reform or civic reform. We've got a couple of different names for it. And what we've done is talk to the reform groups that are focused on a business angle on this and address the question of, what would be legitimate, right? You don't want to take over democracy or civic reform to impose reform. What would be legitimate? And so we started with a set of principles, and then we added a set of sample policies or provisions that companies could agree to. And my thought is that these are urgent because right now, as the stimulus and the next wave of stimulus is being negotiated, people need to know at least what companies are doing to respect civic processes in the public interest and how they are balancing different commitments and priorities. So I won't go in great detail of these. We'll get to the email at the end. Our next step in the project is to convene small groups to go through these. But just briefly, it's to establish some principles around how business legitimately engages with public policy and civic processes. And one saying that competition needs to be free and fair for markets to work, that they depend on a well-functioning government and societal institution and sensible market rules, that they must respect society's civics processes and institutions, and that when these are distorted, we have a shared interest in addressing, creating systemic solutions. We then created a list of provisions, if you do the build on this one, Eric, in the document, and clearly too small to read here. These are synthesized from 3 or 4 sources, including the Harvard Porter Gale project, but also from Rebecca Henderson, and a report called Responsible Lobbying and Responsible Engagement with Climate Policy. It includes a set of things companies could do right now. A good number of these would be things to do right away. For example, why not every company support the SEC rules around materiality and reporting political spending?
Liz, can I interject one quick second? I want to let the audience know that both Liz and Rick have agreed to graciously stay on beyond 11 to keep answering questions, and this is being recorded. So if for any reason you do need to drop off at the top of the hour, you can return back later to review the recording and move to the end where you may have dropped off so you can hear what they say. Keep going, Liz.
And just one last comment on this. Our strategy in this, and I'm getting feedback from strategy leaders and CSR leaders and government affairs folks, is to do small groups that say, here's what we could support if so-and-so also supported it. And we could get 3 to 5 companies to say, here's our starter commitment, but we challenge XYZ company to do the same, and to have those, the mix of companies that pioneer this to be markedly cross-partisan from across the spectrum. And we think the principles here are shared enough to do that. So our next step would be to have some conversations about the content. The second thing in parallel would be the guardrail that Rick will walk through. Sorry, Eric.
Got it. No, just a question that came in is that clearly we're witnessing a crisis of civic disengagement. So you're giving ideas for how people can get involved. The question is, can you suggest any organizations for people to help drive greater civic engagement? This person says they work with business climate leaders and Business for America, among others, and they desperately need more people involved in driving sane policy.
Yeah, fantastic. And I've got good friends at Business for America, terrific. And there are groups, the Time to Vote movement is really good. There are the Civic Alliance, Voter Participation Project, Rock the Vote. There are 5 or 6 others that Leadership Now has endorsed. That's a big priority of theirs, and their reports highlight, and I'm happy to do more after the call. So back to Rick, I think, and I think you need to unmute on the guardrail.
Yeah, and so, as a as a participation strategy, just to pick up on what I said earlier, the concept would be there's great work being done by CPA and others. Someone asked the question about where do those 43 resolutions come from, and there's online you can look at ICCR's 2020 guide to proxy shareholder proposals and see like how many different organizations are behind this. And what we'd like to do, and in fact what this guardrail does, is it sort of takes all of the different resolutions and comes up with a minimum viable product that would say, well, here's a bottom line that we think every company should have, a level of transparency, a level of consistency, so we don't have the problem of CSR group saying one thing and the government affairs saying a different thing, or a trade group that you're a member of saying a different thing. There ought to be shareholder action because it is the shareholders' money that's being put to political use, and there ought to be board involvement so that this is thought of strategically. There ought to be, an agreement not to oppose reasonable spending limits, however we can get to that, given current Supreme Court law. And so those are things we'd like to see. I would love to talk to people who are involved from the investor side, whether as owners or beneficiaries or managers or foundations or endowments, to have those conversations about how to get involved. But I would also say, this does not have to be something that only goes in one direction. I think companies could benefit from encouraging and getting a leg up on investors and saying, we think this is a great policy, we're going to adopt it, we think others ought to adopt it, and sort of have a race to the top.
Hey, Rick, one question came in, and you were touching on the need to create kind of more common language as you look at some of these resolutions. So the question is, how about encouraging more businesses to describe their civic contribution in terms of UN Sustainability Development Goals, or SDGs?
I think that's like a fantastic idea. That actually lines up with a lot of the other work that we're doing at TSC. So not quite today's subject, but I think the SDGs are an incredibly good tool for companies and investors to align on broad sustainability goals.
And I think that I think it's SDG 16 relates to strong institutions. And so the corporate statement would be aligned with that, and it's a great idea to make it more explicit for common language.
Great.
Can we go to the action, the call to action? I think it's the where to go from here, and then Rick and I can wrap up and invite people. So a couple of thoughts on where to go from this point. You are all exactly the people we would love to help shape this, and to think about your company's readiness, what would have to be in a corporate commitment to legitimate political involvement and civic reform. And so if you would, our emails are right here. To review the investor guardrail and provide feedback, might be interesting to look at the resolutions in your company's, if you're public, your company's board packet this year. We can give you a reading list and provide occasional updates on our working group. And then there are also things you can do individually with both the Shareholder Commons and American Promise, especially around business people saying where they stand personally on this issue. And that would also be of incredible value. So please reach out to us. We would love to have this be the start of a conversation on something that could start a new era. And that's happened before. We have done this. The US Chamber of Commerce in the 30s was the voice of business for the support of public interest in an effective way in the 30s. And the CED started with campaign finance reform in the early 70s. We can do this again. Thank you all. Really look forward to continuing.
Great. Another question for you, Elizabeth. Going back to kind of the beginning introduction, there's somebody on one of our attendees is a teacher of economics in business school, and you expressed kind of what you learned about in undergrad around neoclassical economics. And so any books you'd recommend that this professor teaches their students in this context?
Sure, and I would say there's one thing I think is of great service from economics professors in general, but there, first I will say the specific book. I think it's called Morality, Competition, and the Firm, edited by Joseph Heath. And he has an article, one paper in there, but there are a whole bunch of others that show how many of the unethical actions in society today are due to economic market failures, classic market failures, not even values issues until you see consequences. And what would be an ethical way for companies to engage in shaping the rules of the game for the markets? So I think that might be a great source. The other thing I'm noticing is a huge percentage of my colleagues are not well versed in market imperfections. Just the idea of externalities is something that is only a subset are familiar with, and just getting that on the table would be great. And the story I would use would be Ray Anderson with Interface Carpet, discovering externalities and raising moral issues. Those would be the starting points for me off the top of my head.
Well, Interface Carpets is certainly an inspiration for me and early in my career. Another question coming in, perhaps for both of you here, is addressing climate change possible without a constitutional amendment to end Citizens United? And if not, can we prioritize that? This may harken back to some of our discussions about Amendment 28. So I'll defer to which one of you want to take that on first?
Can I do that one?
That's really Elizabeth's question. So.
Yeah. So that's what my father challenged me about, and it's if you dive into this, and I'm happy to again providing reading lists on this as a particular deep dive. There are about 6 or 7 constitutional rulings that have fundamentally changed the incentives for engaging in pay to play and engaging in political spending as a economic strategy. Citizens United was the most pronounced, but there were several others allowing companies to influence ballot initiatives. And Leo Strine's work shows how this is in direct contradiction to corporate law. Literally, the Supreme Court's jurisprudence is not coherent on these. And we can't count on the Supreme Court in the near term to reverse course on this. Jeff Clements, the founder of American Promise, filed a brief in Citizens United. Larry Lessig has been filing, he filed one in McCutcheon. It's difficult for people who have made major decisions that change the course of things to reverse those without some major change in the external world. But there is surprisingly an enormous groundswell of support for limits. 76% of Americans across the political spectrum support reasonable limits, and 20 states have already passed resolutions calling for a constitutional amendment. And in 7 cases in the past, this is what we've done in response to Supreme Court rulings that violated fundamental American tenets. So that would be the thing I would encourage you to get involved in. Business for American Promise is business people speaking about this with a uniquely business perspective in addition to our citizenship hats. This feels like it's the root of the root.
That's great. That's great. So another question, are you considering including disclosure on lobbying as well as political spending in the principles you're developing? Investors are asking for disclosure on both, and it would be great to cover the waterfront on this.
And so I believe in the corporate statement we are, and in the it's a model policy to enable shareholders, employees, and customers to understand the company's perspectives, positions, and why. So I'd be happy to go through. And even internal to a company, I spoke with someone the other day who said she knows that her company is lobbying, but she doesn't know the principles or guidelines and even objectives of that. So that's an essential part of having this system work well.
Great.
I think it makes sense. It is not part of our current draft of our guardrail. I think that guardrail is a work in progress. And the difficulty we always face is guardrails need to be one size fits all, and they need to be very clear. And it's almost like you want to be able to look at it and know whether people are hewing to it. And so anything that is qualitative versus quantitative is difficult, but I am not, that does not mean that we wouldn't do it. And we hope to get more people involved in this project. And if people have good ideas about how to add that to our guardrail, would be very, very interested. Can I go back to like an earlier question, which is just, I think first of all, I was amazed that you said the Heath book, because that was my number. That would have been my number one answer too.
Aha.
I have my
Great.
computer, my camera's in a funny place on my computer, so I have it up on a stack of books, and the bottom book is Morality, Competition, and the Firm by Joseph Heath. So it's a book I always keep close at hand. But just for 2 articles, I think they're classics, and they're still very worth reading. Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, and Thomas Schelling's Ecology of Micromotives. Those articles, just to me, they explain why it is that people of good faith doing what you would expect them to do, when you all add it up together, it can have some terrible consequences. Classic sort of fallacy of composition stuff. All of us acting good together doesn't mean that the results are good as a sum total.
That's great. That's great. Well, I think we should move towards wrapping. We're about 10 minutes after the hour, and I just really wanted to thank you both so much for taking time today, and for all of our attendees who joined us from their living rooms or kitchens or wherever. And I really appreciate everybody taking time out of the day to join us for what is a really important and critical topic for restoring democracy in America. So Rick and Elizabeth, thank you very, very much for bringing your expertise and knowledge and sharing that with us today. I feel very fortunate to have the time with you.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, and to everybody who hung on for the extra 10 minthis.
Great.
Very much
appreciated. And remember, we're all in this together.
And it can't happen without the people on this call. This is who gets the attention of Congress people. This is who can clarify, set the record straight on business's interest. This is important stuff, and really appreciate being part of it. Thank you very much to Future 500 and EarthX.
Great. We're all in this together. Everyone have a good day. Thank you very much.
Bye.